Our eyes are focused on Chicago as the Democratic National Convention kicks off in the Windy City today. Please welcome to ATL Live Emory University Associate Professors and political commentators, Dr. Andra Gillespie, along with Dr. Zachary Peskowitz. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we got to talk a little bit in the back about this. We're going to get into Harris and Walz in just a moment. But of course, we know the keynote speaker tonight is President Joe Biden. This is the first time we've ever seen a convention where most people in the room have not cast their ballot for the nominees. So a really interesting dynamic. What do we expect to hear from President Biden? Zach, we'll start with you.
I think he's going to talk about his legacy, his performance as president, and then this big decision to withdraw from the race and give the Democrats a better chance to beat Donald Trump in November.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's long billed himself as a bridge candidate. He didn't expect the bridge to only be 4 years long, but I think he's also going to figuratively pass the torch to Vice President Harris. And so he's going to make a segue to say how she is a continuation of the work that Democrats had been trying to do before, but he's also going to very clearly say that she is now the titular head of the party.
Absolutely. I think most people can agree that's it, unless there's some wild card that we don't expect thrown out tonight. Now, in the past couple of weeks, right, we've seen a big jolt with the Democratic Party. People seem energized, excited. We now have confirmed as of this morning that in every swing state, Harris is about neck and neck with Donald Trump, and in about half of those, she is actually performing a little bit better, which is very interesting than what we saw, of course, before with Joe Biden. So knowing all of that going into this week, she still has a lot to prove. The whole campaign does. Where do you think her messaging is going to be, and what does she need to tell voters?
You know, there are people who are clamoring for her to provide specifics. I think she's going to be very big on emotion and feeling, but she may provide a few specifics. The whole point of a convention is to energize the base who's going to go out and do the hard work. So I think the real test is actually not this week, it's what happens after that, when all of these delegates go home and they become campaign workers. Are they going to do this job? And is she going to effectively harness the increase and the uptick that we have seen in the number of people who have wanted to volunteer for this campaign? Because it's those people who are going to knock on doors that's going to increase turnout. And that's what is going to win or lose this race for her.
Yes. Any added to that?
I think that's perfect.
I mean, it honestly is,
Yes.
because we know that, I mean, even if you go to her website right now, there isn't anything clear on exactly what she wants to do. How is she different from Biden-Harris when we're now looking at Harris-Walz? This is a different campaign. It does feel younger, a little more energized, and also they're really touting her past as a prosecutor, which is something that was really downplayed previously. We also know that she is running against someone that has some lingering charges and also a convicted felon, so maybe that plays well into the narrative there as well. Okay, so we have protests that are expected in Chicago. We know there is an uphill battle in some department. Where do you see some of the challenges with Harris?
Yeah, so protests are definitely the wild card of this convention. So conventions are carefully stage managed, particularly in prime time. So everything in the convention in the United Center is managed, but then on the streets of Chicago, there is this wild card of protests that could be quite critical of Harris. There's always the memory of 1968 in Chicago, and the possibility of violence or property damage. So that is a real wild card going into this week.
Yes, and we know that a lot of the protests are surrounding what's happening right now in Gaza. Also, the funding and everything tied with Israel as well. And we know that past this week, despite whatever happens with the protests, that's going to be a big part of conversation, especially for younger voters. Where do you see Harris trying to figure that out?
Well, we've seen her try to figure this out as she has been campaigning. So she's been interrupted a few times at some of her campaign rallies. Her first response was a little bit strident, and so she's trying to dial it back a little bit, and she's been a little bit more measured to tell the protesters, I hear your concerns, I share your concerns, I want the hostages home safely, and I want a ceasefire, but we also need to think about the bigger picture here. Which president do you think is going to be a better advocate for Palestinians? Is it going to be Donald Trump, or is it going to be her? And so she's trying to make the case that she's the better person, and so she's asking these folks who are skeptical to work with her because she would see herself as the better alternative to Donald Trump.
Yes, and before we move on to Donald Trump, one last thing on Harris and Walz. What do you feel will just be the overall feel of the week and the vibe? I think excited is one word to use, but there are some other factors at play too.
Energetic, reinvigorated, big change from where the Democrats were a month ago.
Yes, yes. I think the mood has definitely shifted, to say the least. Andrea?
Yeah, they've talked a lot about joy.
Yeah.
And so they want to be happy warriors during this. And so, assuming that they can keep the protests to a minimum, they want to project an image that is the polar opposite of the kind of doomsday message that Donald Trump seems to thrive on.
And he will be traveling with J.D. Vance this week. We know they're going to be on that trail, specifically looking at the swing states, because that is where some of their numbers have fallen. Do we think he will change any sort of messaging moving forward?
I think, maybe moderating the messaging. I think, a big issue that we've seen in the polling is that some of these Sunbelt states that were looking pretty safe for the Trump campaign are now very much in play. So just picking off one of the northern states might not be enough for the Trump-Vance campaign. So they're going to have to play defense in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Donald Trump's biggest problem is himself. And so I think the million-dollar question that we have is, one, can they find a message that resonates and that sticks against this new Democratic ticket? But then also, can Donald Trump be disciplined enough to deliver it? So instead of going off into recriminations, instead of throwing every racist and sexist trope at the wall to see what sticks, instead of making, bizarre comments about, how he's better looking than Kamala Harris, right? He's going to have to figure out how to kind of rein in his baser instincts. If he doesn't do that, it's going to cost him votes. It's just a question of whether or not it costs him enough to lose the election.
Right, we'll find out in less than 80 days, which is, hard to believe. It's coming up quickly. Thank you both very much for being here and the insight. We really do appreciate it. Also, Atlanta News First political reporter Doug Reardon is in Chicago and will be reporting from the convention live later today. He will lead WANF special coverage each night through